And as we begin our lunchtime keynote, Diana Sedney from Chevron will introduce Ambassador Pascual.
Good afternoon. First of all, I want to say thank you to Dr. Stent and the CERES team here. For those of you who've been here through the morning, know what an outstanding collection of speakers and wealth of information we've had the opportunity to share in this morning. So thanks for organizing this. It's a particularly timely and relevant topic, especially for Chevron. We just celebrated our 20th anniversary of our major project in Kazakhstan this past weekend with Tengiz Chevroil. That particular project, it's been a successful partnership, but at the same time, in reviewing the region this morning, it's clear that there are a lot of opportunities still out there, as well as challenges. That's why it's been so helpful to have the U.S. government as a strong supporter for energy investment in the region. And Dr. Schaefer referenced this earlier. And recognizing that, I think that's why Secretary Clinton in 2011 elected to choose a very strong advocate, not just for Eurasia, but the world. But for today, we'll focus just on Eurasia. But she chose an outstanding advocate for energy diplomacy. And that, of course, is Ambassador Pascual. So it's my pleasure today to be able to introduce Ambassador Pascual as the Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy at the still relatively new bureau at State Department, the Bureau for Energy Resources. You have your bio in front of you, so I won't go through that. But I did want to point out, Ambassador Pascual has served as ambassador in Mexico, Ukraine, senior director at the NSC for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia. So you've worked in countries where energy is a critical issue. And again, looking at it from both the opportunities and the challenges point of view. So you're ideally situated to be our energy diplomat in chief right now. You've understood not only the economic importance of energy for these nations, for these regions, but also the geopolitical and geostrategic importance. Today, you're traveling the globe, engaging with key stakeholders regularly, helping to build understanding, not only about energy security, but energy security really as a fundamental pillar of national security as well as global security. So thanks a lot for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join us today. And please join me in welcoming Ambassador Pascual.
Diane, thank you very much. Thank you and Chevron for your sponsorship of the event. Angela, always your leadership in this part of the world and looking at the interconnections between issues, the way national security, energy questions, political questions so closely intersect and define the politics and the direction of the region. You've been a leader in that for many, many years, and I've been learning from you ever since we first met, I think on a stage in 1995 in Houston, Texas, appropriately so, when you think back to the energy connections on these issues. Lots of friends around the room. I'm not going to try to say hello to everybody, but it's a real pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you, people I've known in different incarnations. What I'd like to try to do is to explore the geopolitics of the radical changes that are starting to occur in the energy world in which we live in today. I know you heard from Dan Yergin a bit earlier. Dan's book is on right in front of him, The Quest. Buy many copies of it. You'll learn everything that you need to know beyond anything I could teach you. But the thing that I have just been so fascinated by is the phenomenal degree of change that's happening in the world of energy the impact that that is having geopolitically around the world, and still how much we haven't even thought of as we go into the future. And so what I want to try to do is give you a feel for that. I'm going to cover a lot of issues related to Europe and Eurasia, but I'm going to actually go beyond that. And I think one of the things that you're going to see is that the connections beyond Europe and Eurasia are actually quite integrated with what's happening in Eurasia as well. So let's take a look. So let me talk about three energy revolutions that are taking place right now. One of them is what's happening on the demand side. In 2012, for the first time, the non-OECD countries amounted for a greater share of consumption, of energy consumption, than the OECD countries. And if you look out into the future on the red or orange color that's growing, the bulk of energy demand growth in the future is going to come from the non-OECD countries. If you look at the green line below, it's China. The orange line is the United States, which is pretty much flat. India doesn't look like it's sloping up that much, but it's actually increasing at a pretty fast rate as well. And so here's one of the things that we have not really gotten our heads around. In the future, the potential gaps between supply and demand in places like China and India and Brazil and South Africa are going to be the pull factors that affect global prices of energy, particularly on oil. And it's going to become in our self-interest to understand how how China and India and Brazil and South Africa and the emerging economies are actually satisfying demand. Because if they can't address their demand requirements into the future, we're going to be affected by the price impacts that we experience back here in the United States. And so if that has a direct interest on our economic growth, how do we incorporate these issues into the way that we conduct our foreign policy with these countries? That's not a normal part of our foreign policy and diplomacy in the future, and it's part of what we have to learn as we go forward. Second part revolution that we're going through right now, I don't know, Dan, how much you might have talked about this, is the massive revolution that we're having in energy production in the United States and in other parts of the world. This just looks at, in the United States, the U.S. oil production from shale formations. You can see in 2012, just from shale formations, there was an increase of production of about 850,000 barrels a day, about 1 million barrels a day overall. North Dakota has become the second largest oil-producing state in the United States, and it's had a phenomenal impact on U.S. balances. If we combine that, let's look at on the left-hand side over here. If you look at the bottom part of that chart, which shows the overall increase in production, and you combine that with the measures that have been taken in energy efficiency, particularly fuel efficiency, the United States, this is translating that now into percentages of oil imports, or imports as a percentage of total consumption, from over 60% in 2005 to about 39% in 2012. And so this has just produced a massive change in the United States' position on its ability to get physical access to energy supplies. And it's one of the reasons why we're starting to hear the question asked over and over again, well, if the United States is increasingly moving towards self-reliance, do we care about global politics and global security in the same way that we have in the past? The answer to that is absolutely yes, for a couple of reasons. The red line that we see right here is total global production as it's projected into the year 2035. The small gap between the red line and the orange line is what we generally call spare capacity. The amount of additional oil that can be put in the market within 30 days and sustained for another 90 days. So why is this important? Think about Libya in 2011. Took about 1.5 million barrels of oil off of the market, 1.5 million barrels a day of oil off of the market. We saw a price increase from about $85 a barrel to $130 a barrel during that period of time. 1.5 million barrels against a market that at that point was about 89 million barrels a day. The reason for that is not just the overall supply in the market, but it's also how you think about any disruptions relative to spare capacity. Total amount of spare capacity in the world right now is about 2.5 million barrels a day. The vast majority of that is in one country, in Saudi Arabia. If you consume 1.5 million barrels a day in just one country, Libya, what you basically told the marketplace is that your ability to respond to the next crisis is suddenly extraordinarily compromised in a market where you have both inelastic demand and inelastic supply, and the potential for price increases are extraordinarily high. And so what this brings us back to is that we have to care about how that entire supply curve is filled underneath. If you have major disruptions in any piece of it, and if you look at that vis-a-vis spare capacity, it can have massive global impacts. And if you associate that as well with the reality that more and more of the demand drivers and the price drivers in the market are going to be in places like China and India and South Africa and Brazil, what it starts to tell us is that the ability of other countries to satisfy their markets is key. The ability of maintaining or assuring that these producers can stay on track is going to have a critical impact to the United States. And so the answer to that, where this brings us back, is that yes, we still have a critical stake in stability in the Middle East. We still have a critical stake in the security of transport lanes and in global peace and security. Just because the United States has become increasingly more self-reliant, it doesn't mean that we've been able to withdraw our concerns from the energy sector into the future. Let me say a few words about gas. In 2011, we hit a critical breaking point where natural gas became the dominant fuel in the U.S. economy. As a result of this, and in 2012, last year, we actually produced more electricity using gas than coal for the first time in our history, which has resulted in our lowest CO2 emissions in the last 16 years. And a big factor of that, the biggest factor, has been the production of shale gas. In the year 2005, shale gas accounted for about 1% of U.S. production. Last year, it was about 35%. You can see it's projected to increase to about 50% in 2040. And if you combine that with tight gas and coal bed methane, unconventional, so-called unconventional gases will make up about 80% of U.S. production. This has had an enormous impact, obviously, in the United States in depressing prices, in making more gas available for electricity production and for other sources, other economic purposes, such as petrochemicals. But the thing that I find particularly interesting is that the revolution in gas that we're seeing in the United States is not the only revolution that we see today. This is based on IEA data, PIRA data, and some other inputs that we've taken into account based on inputs that we've gotten from our travel. The red line looks at planned LNG export capacity. The blue line takes into account projections that we've heard from different countries and investors around the world. What the slope of that curve starts to tell you is that the increases in production that we're going to be seeing in the world are not just from the United States. The increases in export capacity are not just from the United States, but a whole range of other countries. I'll come back to that. So you can look on the left-hand side of the page and see the traditional suppliers, Russia, Iran, and Turkmenistan, and increases that are projected there. And on Russia, Gazprom's own figures are that they'll increase production to about 1 trillion cubic meters a day by 2035. And then you see at the bottom here, we still don't have estimates of what the annual production volumes are going to be, but particularly Mozambique, which actually the places that I've served, when I served in Mozambique for 2.5 years, I can assure you when I was there between 1989 and 91, in the middle of the war, the last thing that was in anybody's mind was that Mozambique was going to be an energy-producing country, but some of the largest gas finds in the world in the last 30 years. So if you start taking this into account, with increases supplies from Australia, Mozambique, Norway, the largest gas find since 1942, increases in Russia that we may see coming into the future, Israel, which I'll come back to, and you combine that with this chart, which is an increasing percentage of gas globally that is traded as LNG, then the question it poses to us is whether we're ever going to see a map like this again into the future. You can see on the left-hand side at Henry Hub, U.S. prices at about $3.20. They've been fluctuating between $3.20 and $3.50. In Europe, about $10. In East Asia, been going between $15 and $20. South Asia, consistently about $15. If you have these greater supplies, and if literally this market becomes more liquid into the future, what can we expect this market to begin to look like, and what are going to be some of the geopolitical impacts that are going to be associated with that? So let me take that into account and talk about a few of these examples. The red dots that you see here are existing LNG terminals in Europe. The orange ones are planned LNG terminals. The green lines are existing pipelines. The orange lines are potential future pipelines that we might see in the future. As a result of the increased production of gas in the United States, we have radically curtailed our expected imports. At this point in time, we were expecting to be importing about 80 BCM of gas a year. We're importing 5 from Canada. As a result of that, supplies have been redirected, some to Europe, some to Asia, principally to Europe at one point from Qatar and Trinidad and Tobago. That has begun to create greater competition in the European market. That, associated with policy changes that the EU has put in place through the third energy package, which has anti-monopoly provisions so that you can't supply the gas, own the pipelines, and own the distribution networks. You have to provide third-party access to pipelines. There have been interconnectors that have been created across countries, and those are beginning to proceed, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So that as a result of this, you are increasingly getting in Europe a real gas market where gas can be traded and swapped across countries. The result has been that the largest utilities in Western Europe have pretty much all renegotiated their supply contracts with Gazprom, both to reduce price and to increase and lengthen the financing terms. It's also created a situation, let me see where increasingly the kind of situation that we saw in 2009, where as a result of the gas dispute between Russia and Ukraine, you had massive downstream impacts into Western Europe when gas supplies were cut off. So just look a little microcosm of this, of what we're starting to see in the future. In this top corner over here is a planned LNG terminal that's going to be coming in, I forgot right now exactly when, next year and a half or so in Poland. They're expanding this pipeline that goes down to Ukraine. There's an interconnector that already exists here. There's a pipeline which needs to be built here and connected to some existing pipes here. There are existing pipelines that will take you from either, actually there's going to be an LNG terminal that goes this way. There's a pipeline that could potentially go in this direction. You could potentially come in that direction. The point of this is that over time, it's going to be possible for countries to import gas through Poland, through Germany. It could be Norwegian gas. It could be Russian gas. That could be moved backwards into Ukraine. That could be moving into Lithuania. And if you combine that with the storage systems in Western Ukraine, this can become a hub for the eastern part of a European gas market that is providing the ability to buy gas during the summer, for example, and become the buffer for reducing increased prices into the Baltics or even into this part of Central Europe. A radically different perspective of what we saw even just a decade ago. And what we see right now is Russia beginning to respond to this because there's a real competition for markets right now. And so let's just look at, again, a little microcosm of this. Russia has pipelines that are going Nord Stream, about 55 BCM capacity, and they're using about 13 of it. Through the Yamal Peninsula that goes through Belarus and into Poland and into Germany, about 45 BCM, which is almost fully utilized, and they're looking at potentially expanding that. Ukraine, which is now only being used at about 85 out of about 145 BCM capacity. And Russia is now looking at and saying that it's going to build South Stream, which would, if built to full capacity, would be another 63 BCM. And the question one then has to ask is, well, why? Because you have on the European side a market which has been fairly compressed as a result of a depressed European market generally, a reduction in demand within Europe. And in the meantime, Russia is looking at further potentially expanding pipeline capacity into the West, while at the same time they have a total of 15 BCM export capacity into Europe, into Asia, which is the fastest growing gas market in the world. So what's happening here, and how do you explain these pieces? Another dimension of this, which a number of the people around the room have great familiarity with, and I know you've been talking about, is how does this play into the Southern Corridor options on gas coming out of Azerbaijan, going through Turkey, and then either taking the Nabucco West line or the TAP line through Greece and Italy. We don't know how this all is going to play itself out in the marketplace, but if you ask yourself the question, is there new gas that's going to come into Europe? If there is going to be new gas, the one place it is going to come from is over here. Because if this is built, already you have pipeline capabilities that are beyond existing consumption in Western Europe. And the likelihood is that if you see South Stream being built, you're going to see simply supplies being moved from up here somewhere to the south. And so this story is playing itself out before our eyes right now. We're going to see a choice made sometime in June about whether the Shah Deniz consortium is going to go in Nabucco West or through TAP. The position that the United States has taken is that we support whatever is commercially viable. We support options that can eventually get gas into this part of Europe as well, so that if there is a decision to go in this direction, the companies have seriously been talking about interconnections that can be built into Bulgaria or connecting into this pipeline system over here. But this is one of the big factors that's going to play itself out in the future. But let me just, not just even the distant future, but the next few months, but let me just put this into context. The debate over here has been over 16 BCM, 6 staying here, 10 continuing this way. While that has occurred, Europe's consumption of LNG has gone from about 25 BCM to 75 BCM over the last decade. And so the big story in competition has not been this. This is an important development, a critical development for Caspian gas, for providing other alternatives in the southern part of Europe. But if you look at it from a perspective of Russia, the huge dimension has been what happened to LNG and the LNG market, and how has Russia played into that? And so it's one of those questions that you have to ask yourself, okay, what is the strategy here for further investment in pipelines, and how does that play into the competitive market that we're seeing develop into the future? I want to spend a second on Israel, and I'm just looking at my watch for a minute because there's so many interesting stories here that one could get caught up in, and I want to give enough time for questions and answers. But what's fascinating to me is that the Tamar field is supposed to be able to come online. Last time we checked with the relevant companies, sometime this month. I don't know if you're hearing the same thing, Dan, or others. It's producing already? Okay. So with the Saturday, well, congratulations. So at what level did you start out at? The amount that they're going to quickly come to is about 7 BCM per year. Israel's consumption of gas is about 10 BCM. And it's, when you think about this in context of a state that is so small, the radical impact that this is going to have on Israel is phenomenal. And then if you look at the potential development of the Leviathan field that would allow Israel to export if it makes the decision to grant that export licenses and export routes, it puts Israel in a radically different position throughout the neighborhood. And then combining that with the potential in Cyprus, there's probably going to be a bid round that comes out of Lebanon sometime soon. It's the Middle East, so there are border issues that continue to be worked on, and there are lots of options being put on the table on how to resolve them. And of course, there are export route questions of, do you go through LNG? Do you go through pipeline routes? Where's your maximum flexibility? And that inevitably gets built into the political complexities of the region. And then add on to that the political crisis in Cyprus and how that plays into the entire region as well. The complications are huge, but the positive flip side here is that these energy resources, if managed in a way that advance the interest of Israel, of Lebanon, their neighbors, of Cyprus, and if Cyprus and Turkey can come to an understanding of how those energy resources benefit the entire island, those energy resources can be a huge facilitator of resolving political conflict in what has traditionally been an intractable part of the world. And so this is one of the big issues that we've been working through and trying to understand how to make this a positive force for change. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on Iraq and Iran because it would be almost impossible for me not to. But there's a phenomenal story here out of Iraq. At the end of 2011, Iraq was producing about 2.6 to 2.7 million barrels a day. If you went back a year before, it would have been somewhere around 2.3, 2.4. Today, it's producing, I think it's giving up on me. There we go. 3.0. Part of that has been because of weather disruptions in the Persian Gulf. So that figure was consistently as high as about 3.4 a few months ago. The potential that they have is 3.9. And one of the big issues is, of course, what happens in Kurdistan and what kind of understanding is reached between Iraq and the Kurdish Republic. The reality is that a lot of international companies are investing in Kurdistan. Chevron, ExxonMobil, Total, Gazprom, Repsol, Eni. And at some point, there's going to be a significant amount of production. And the reality is that that oil has either the potential to be a source for understanding between the Kurds and the Baghdad government in a way that connects it to a unified export strategy, or if they can't come up with a unified export strategy, it's going to consistently be a source of tension because it will raise the issue of how is that oil going to find an export outlet? How are the revenues then going to be returned either to Baghdad or to Kurdistan? And how is this done in a way which meets the political views of both Baghdad and Kurdistan on what is permissible within the Constitution? Right now, there's not a solution to that problem, and so what has happened is that oil, rather than be a unifying factor between North and South, has been something which has been pulling the two apart. And the challenge that we're facing together with Turkey, which is another big part of this equation, and is potentially a major export route to international markets, is how to turn this into a way that all of the parties win, so that you can have interconnecting pipelines that go from Basra up north to Haditha, that connect to the Iraq-Turkey pipeline, that provide an alternative to exports through the Strait of Hormuz, and allow production from Kurdistan to be able to link into that. Ironically, if you look on a map, it's not that complicated. When you get into the politics, it is hugely complicated, and it's one of the big challenges that these countries face and that we're trying to be a supportive friend on right now. Iran, I wanted to just say a few words on this. Since January 2012, when the United States and Europe began to implement sanctions on Iran, Iran at that stage was exporting about 2.5 million barrels a day. Today, it's been exporting about 1.2 to 1.3 million barrels a day. One of the interesting things, if you look on the global market, is if you compare with the global market where it was in January, the increases that we've seen in that market, principally from the United States, Libya, and Iraq, the declines from Iran and other sources, where we've ended up is actually a more robust market than what we had at the beginning of this period of time. And it's one of the reasons why oil right now, despite the reduction of those supplies out of Iran, is trading at today, Brent crude at about $105 a barrel. But it's been very volatile. It's been going consistently between $105 to $120 a barrel, and it just underscores the degree of political risk premium that exists. And so one of the challenges that we've had in implementing the oil sanctions on Iran is to ensure that we're working on this with our international partners on the supply side in a way that takes cognizance of where the increased supplies are going to come from. And on the demand side, to work with countries that have been the principal importers like China, India, Japan, Korea, Turkey, and to essentially ask the question, what are the prospects for diversification in your oil imports that you might be able to look at? Because if in the end you become overly dependent on oil from a particular source that could become volatile, then if everybody is looking to switch supplies at the same time, that becomes a volatility to your own marketplace as well. And it's been as a result of that discussion that we've been able to work through these issues and successfully implement these kinds of declines, about 1.5 million, 1.2 million barrels a day, while at the same time looking at relative price stability in the market. But it's not something you can take as a guarantee. It's not over at any point in time. It's a constant challenger job that we face. I wanted to keep moving east for a minute and go back to Asia. And let me switch back to gas for a second and the point that I made earlier on export capacity out of Russia. So 15 BCM coming, I'm going to get Angela, help me find Sakhalin. Somewhere over here. 15 BCM coming out of Sakhalin right now. 120 or so BCM going to the West in terms of export capabilities. In terms of growing gas demand, Asia has seen the biggest gas demand growing into the future. And so the big question that we've been trying to ask on Asia is, what have we learned from the European experience? Because there what we saw is that if you have a combination of increased supply, increased infrastructure, the investments that have been made in LNG infrastructure in connecting pipelines, and then the software of that infrastructure, the rules of the road on competition and the regulation of the marketplace, that it was possible over a relatively short period of time, I'm going to say less than a decade, but I would even say even a shorter period of time than that, over the course of a decade, a radical change in the nature of the European market. So what kinds of changes could be helpful in the context of this market to be able to deepen the extent to which there are hubs that are trading gas, to do that in a way that reduces volatility in the market, to do it in a way which is fair to the interests of major American companies that happen to have investments in Australia, and at the same time take into account the interest of consumers. And the way that that question gets answered in the structure and development of this market is also going to have huge implications for the principal potential suppliers. And if you go back to, I think you mentioned at the end of your panel, Iran having the second largest gas reserves in the world, Russia having the largest gas reserves in the world. Does it matter if they trade that gas into this global market through pipelines that create a point-to-point monopoly between the supplier and the consumer, or whether they're trading into a market where there are a number of players, where there's competition and creates options? You bet. It absolutely does. And so this is part of the challenge that we're working on right now in asking these questions, but being able to address them in a way that takes into account the realistic requirements of the companies that are making the investments, the interests of the consumers, and the way to maximize the way that they intersect in the marketplace. Last thing I wanted to leave you with, though, is a point that I think I always try to remind myself of, which is that gas is become hugely important as a bridging fuel, but it's not necessarily a panacea. So this is from an IEA projection that looks at one of their more robust scenarios for increased gas consumption into the future. And the impact it has is it bends the coal curve, gas becomes competitive with oil. Renewables still continue to grow, not at a huge pace. But what this scenario leaves us with is this, which is outcome of a 3.5 degree temperature increase and a global CO2 concentration of 650 parts per million by 2050, which for any of you that are familiar with the climate change debate and follow that science, where the IPCC has come out is that you can't allow the temperature to go up above 2 degrees centigrade. Some argue that it can't even be that much, and that 450 parts per million is our limit. So one of the challenges that we face as we work through all of these issues is not only the geopolitics of it, but the environmental aspects as well, so that we understand how gas is used as a bridging fuel, how we take advantage of it, looking at the experience that we've had in the United States, where it's been a principal driver of our reduced CO2 emissions. If you think about the impact that that could have, say, in China, in bending its demand curve for coal, the impact can be huge. But we have to recognize as well, if that is our only option, it won't get us to where we need to be. So how do we integrate gas with other renewables, particularly wind, solar, in terms of gas providing greater baseload capacity, and how do we use this 10-year period that we might have as a bridging fuel to come up with outcomes that are good for us environmentally, while at the same time addressing all of the other points I've tried to lay out on increased global competition and how that competition is good for us both economically and in our geopolitics. And I'm happy to answer questions and take the conversation wherever you'd like.